And welcome back to Brothers in Boots. My name is Mike,
My name is Jeff.
and today we are going to be talking about welts. Now, last time we didn't do this, and by request, we're going to go ahead and intro as to, why someone should care about our opinion in boots. So, any of you that have seen me before have potentially seen me from Dale's Real Boot Talk. I've done 3 of those with him, one on sizing, one on heels, and one on every MTO option that could possibly exist between multiple brands. Hopefully, if you watched that last one, it's a little over 5 hours. Hopefully, you watched it in sections and didn't watch it all at once. But I own just a little over 30 boots from 9 makers. I've owned 13 makers, but I've passed some on that either didn't work for me or needed to move on for one reason or another. My boots tend to range much more on the high end, so I have stuff in the around $500 range to the $3,000 range. Overall, I enjoy the process of talking to the makers, actually knowing what they want and like, and working within their styles before I do any ordering, which does make the process take quite a bit longer. But that is the traditional aspects of boot making that I enjoy the most.
My name is Jeff. I admin several boot groups, have relationships in the industry, have been a lifelong footwear nerd with a focus on boots. Generally speaking, part of my personality is that I analyze and study things to death. So my opinion has become valued by many, and this seems like a good way to help shorten other people's journey. I do try to stick more in the 500 to $1,000 range most of the time, and I don't even want to think about how many pairs of boots I have. So leave that at that.
Alrighty, so welts. So when we talk about welts, we have 5 we'll call mainstream or common kinds of welts. You have your traditional hand welt, its factory faster cousin, the Goodyear welt, the stitch down, sometimes known as veltschoen, which is Dutch for field shoe, which is what you're going to see the Indonesians do a lot of times. They actually make just as many veltschoen as they do hand welt. You're going to have the traditional Pacific Northwest method of nail down, which I believe we looked up, and there's only one or two whites models that still do this, and they might be the only one that offered it besides Westco that did do it on a 100-year edition recently. Potentially, you could get it by request. That might not be a thing anymore, so inquire with them if that's something you're interested in. And then the last one, I'll just call specialty welts, but that's going to be like your Norwegian, your stairwelt, your double welt, stuff like that. That is welts that are more focused on an aesthetic more so than actual functionality, right?
So we'll start with which one, the hand welt?
Yep. So starting with the hand welt, and this one's important too because hand welt is short of the stitch down. Hand welt is the basis of all of these other welts. Stitch down is going to be a little bit closer to nail down, and we'll talk about when they get to it because there's some interesting aspects to nail down. But overall, hand welting is where everything kind of began. Short, obviously moccasin construction, but in hand welt, there's 3 key components. I'm going to put a screenshot up here on screen for everybody to see. This is called a holdfast. It is the first part of what makes hand welt a hand welt construction. Now, this piece of leather right here that you see on screen is just the holdfast. It's basically just the footbed. And these are going to be a little bit thicker than even the Pacific Northwest footbeds that they use today, and it's because a large portion of it gets channeled out to do the hand welt process. This outer ring that you see here, this channel, is made for the upper to tuck under and the skived portion of the welt to sit in, so that way it's flat against the bottom and needs minimal cavity filling in this area. This channel here is for the actual stitches themselves. Unlike a Goodyear welt that leaves a very large cavity that needs a lot of cork or leather filler in there to fill in, this method of hand welt is going to be significantly tighter and have way less cavity. Some of this is just going to be filled with a very small strip of leather in this area here, and then an anti-squeak material for the midsole layer. On this one, this is a picture from Custom Craft. This is what he's got pinned out here is called the golden section. We'll talk about that in a later video. But when it comes to hand welting, it's a very expensive process. Ignoring the Indonesian makers, it is about $1,000 more expensive than any of the Goodyear welt or stitch down makers in the United States. It's a very labor-intensive process, and it takes a lot of skill to execute. It's the most adjustable of all the welts. Now, keep in mind I said adjustable, not durable, not necessarily better. Adjustability allows lots of customizing, but if you're a wildland firefighter, I would not be spending an extra $1,000 to have a hand welted boot to wear out in burning embers, so that your boots slightly get tinged every time you wear them, right?
Yeah, extra adjustability is not going to help you in that respect, and the extra adjustability is not going to be as strong, as tough of a boot. So it'd be a bit double negative.
Yep. Now there are some versions of hand welt, like I'm going to show a picture from Creosote Boots here. This is a 360-degree German style hand welt. This is an extremely durable construction. It's also ranks up there in terms of water resistance with the stitch down McKay lock stitch combo. But this boot is over $1,000 more expensive than any of the Pacific Northwest boots in terms of like their work lineup. Is not something that someone is going to take out and purposely damage. That boot right there that I showed runs around the $1,900 mark before taxes and shipping. 600. What was it up to? $675 for the Type 1 Commander these days. Does that sound right?
Yep. Sounds about right.
Yeah, obviously the Type 1 Commander, not only is it a third of the price, but it's also going to be a little bit easier to do certain things to, in terms of like rebuilding, making slight adjustments to, in the process of rebuilding, you are going to eventually lose some of your midsole and welt lengths that you can go down to a single row. That's a single row boot to start with. So the second you hit the stitches, it's time for a new welt. But it is the most traditional welt. It's also considered the most artisanal. I don't know how you say that. It's hand welted boots are a work of art as much as they are a tool.
And you don't have to get them remade as often as we were just talking about.
Correct.
So you're paying to get it done once rather than paying it to fuck it all up and do it again.
Exactly. Now, hand welted boots are just as rebuildable as the Pacific Northwest boots, but as Jeff mentioned, it's not going to be a $300 rebuild. It's going to be way more, because to change the footbed out, for example, they've got to carve a new one of these holdfasts. I'm going to go ahead and bring it back up again. The holdfast here. You've got to recarve another one of these holdfasts. That's time and money. As I said, in the United States, these are $1,000 more expensive than a pair of the Pacific Northwest builders any day of the week.
That customer just has to worry about resoles. It's nice that you could rebuild it, but they're just worried about resoles.
Exactly. Now, on that, there are a couple different styles of hand welt, and I'm going to show a couple screenshots. So I showed right here, this is the 360 degree. This is a German style. There's lots of different styles of hand welt when it comes to hand welting. They just talk about angles, the way the material's used, some of the channel depths. That part's not as important. That's a question or a conversation you would want to have with your maker about talking about the differences and what they're comfortable with. Usually they have their style. German is a specific 45-degree angle, which is why I mentioned some waterproofness. So if you talk about traditional English, the angle's a lot steeper. Waterproofness is definitely not a thing there. But right here, you're going to see a cowboy boot. And this is going to be another hand welted style boot. This is from Texas Traditions. But this has what's called a Mexican welt, where the waist of the boot and the heel of the boot are whip stitched to that insole. So it's only carved in this front area, and in the later half, this is actually only 160-degree welt. You're going to see that this whip stitch that goes through here secures the uppers to the holdfast, but there's no extra carving for this. And this is done because in this next process of the boot, they carve out an area for the shank and add additional leather there for that part. So as you can see here, they've carved out some area of the holdfast for the shank. This is made out of a 40 penny nail. And then they've put the two of these kind of leather squeak pads in, and then put an actual leather shank cover, very similar to the way the Pacific Northwest put a leather shank cover in to cover that after the welt has been stitched on. As you can see, this is the beginning part with the whip stitch and the hand lasting, and this is the actual completed product. Now, when we talk about hand welting, much like all of these other processes we're going to talk about with the exception of Goodyear welting, they all do require, besides one company I can think of, they're all hand lasted. In this case, that would be Jim Green. They do a machine lasted stitch down, but the rest of these are all going to be hand lasted. Hand welt has to be hand lasted. There's no process I've seen or heard of that you could use a machine, have it lasted and nailed down in such a way that then you could hand welt it from that point. That I've never heard of anybody being able to do that, because part of the machine lasting it is it running through. But there might be an exception out there. I'm sure someone in the comments, if they know, is going to let us know. These all need to be hand lasted, and that's a big advantage. Why is Goodyear welt cheaper? Because a machine lasts it, does the Goodyear welt machine runs the welt around it, and it's done. No muss, no fuss. All these guys that hand welt it, this will set on the last from anywhere from 3 days to 6 weeks, which is a very time intensive process of not touching it, not to mention the fact that it takes multiple hours to hand welt. This is not something that's done in the course of 45, 50 minutes. It's a solid hour, hour and a half per boot.
God bless their hands.
That is true. Now, that being said, one advantage of hand welt is there's a lot of rebuildability in not needing to tear the whole boot down. Something like stitch down, there's just to rebuild and do some replacements, there's a lot of tear down that needs to be done. With hand welting, there's way less tear down that needs to be done. You need a new welt. Once again, the holdfast and the holes are all there, so it's very easy for a cobbler or even the original maker without the last in it to put a new footbed in, just lining all the holes back up. That's something that can be done. Easy to put a new welt on. No muss, no fuss. In the case of the picture I showed, I'm going to put it back up on screen again. This guy right here, if you were to take the welt off because of this style welt and this whip stitch that goes to the uppers to the holdfast, putting a new welt on this guy is nothing because this part won't come off. It's just about lining the holes up in the upper area to put the welt back on. So that's one advantage. I mean, it's the same process that a cobbler or a maker would do with a Goodyear welt as well, right? The difference is they're just not doing it with a machine.
Oh, I guess we do Goodyear welt next, since we've already kind of brought it up and discussed it.
Yeah. I mean, Goodyear welt is the same process. It's a machine that lasts it over, holds it in place, puts some staples in place, and then it runs around and puts a welt on. Whenever they re-welt something, they slowly turn your uppers into Swiss cheese because there's no way to make sure the machine punches the same holes. That's why a lot of people send their boots to cobblers that will do it by hand for $300-$400 to re-welt something.
A Goodyear welt could be done by hand, but there's no good reason for it. I mean, the whole basis for why it was invented was to be able to use a machine, was to be able to speed things up, get a lot more boots done a lot faster. But in theory, of the definition of it, it can certainly be done by hand. It basically means that you've got an extra piece of leather or plastic or rubber that you're putting between the two to join everything together. And somebody could certainly choose to do that by hand. But by the time you're spending that much time and effort, you might as well be doing a complete stitch down because it's better and more versatile, as we already discussed. So yeah, we do view Goodyear welt as being only machine made, and it's fairly easy for a cobbler to redo a stole, resole them a Goodyear welt.
Yep, and that's a good point. So that piece of leather, rubber, or felt that Jeff was talking about is called a gemming or a gemming. I've heard it pronounced both ways. That's the technical term of the piece that's glued onto the footbed that allows you to do that without carving the hand channels.
And if you like history, the Goodyear welt is not entirely related to Goodyear tires, but not exclusively not either. It was the son. Actually, that family has had a long history of cobblers. Before one of them was trying to come up with a vulcanizing process for for boots for cobblers, and ended up deciding that it would make a good tire, and he set off to make his fortune. His son kept on dabbling in cobblers, in cobblering because that was their family history, and then he ended up creating the machine to do the Goodyear welting.
Yep, and it's probably, besides an outsole stitcher, the most widely used shoe creation machine in existence these days.
It's funny, and you see some beginners will actually think that a Goodyear welt is an end all be all and that it's great. Because in that middle tier area, it gets discussed about so much and bragged about so much that it does sound great. So it is something that is considered, that's put on a pedestal by some, but when you start geeking out and getting into the higher stuff like we're discussing generally here, it is the lower end of what we can be discussing.
Yep, it is probably the inferior welt on this list of welts, except for maybe nail down, but we'll get to that. That's a very uh, it's very common from a Pacific Northwest terminology, but in boots overall, it's a obscure welting technique historically.
Which I guess we can talk about now. Are we
Yep.
done with Goodyear welting? I mean, there
I,
wasn't much
I
to
think
say about it.
I think that kind of covers it. I mean, I think the biggest thing there is just understanding that Goodyear welting is a faster, simpler, cheaper form of hand welting. So just understanding that Goodyear welting should only really be used in boots sub $500 unless we're talking exotic leathers like shell cordovan, reptile, ostrich, stuff like that. Generally speaking, we shouldn't be ending with Goodyear welting. We should be starting with Goodyear welting and working our way away from Goodyear welting.
So the nail down, as we started to talk about, is the traditional way for the Pacific Northwest boots for most work boots. It's not as traditional as a stitch down, but next to that, it's probably the oldest. It got used on all the caulking boots that people were using, and it is mostly abandoned today. White's has one, as he mentioned. Not really sure why it's being offered or what their sales are, or if they do. It, it might just be a way of covering all bases and being able to put on your website, hey, we do it all. And they might not sell any. There might be some old timers that used it with their caulking boots and still think it best. And so it might be there for those occasional guys. But it's not as waterproof. It's not as water resistant. It is going to let more water in over time. The nails are going to rust over time. So, you're going to have corrosion and then microabrasion and then full on abrasion, and not the best choice. It could be cool as a bragging right to have something different than everybody else. Creosote does offer it. I think it's as a traditional nod and to be different. But Mike knows more about creosote. He might know a better reason for why he offers it.
So the nail shank is actually called the nail shank because of the he uses a nail to make the shank. And he makes a coffin for it to sit in. But Gabbard uses nail down for the lasting process. All those nails get removed for hand welting by the time it's done. To explain
Sure.
what the what the nail down really is, if you've ever watched, Nix has a ton of videos online of their boots being made. The stitch down process starts literally as a nail down, that they pull the nails out and do the stitch down portion later. Imagine a nail down is when they've lasted it over by hand, they've nailed everything in, and then what they do is they glue a welt down, and then they go and they drive nails into the welt to hold the welt in place, and then pull the middle nails out, smooth it down, and then do what looks like a Goodyear welt from there. That's what a nail down really is, right? I mean, the stitch down. I don't want to say stitch down has its roots in it because the stitch down style is actually older, but the way the Pacific Northwest guys do the stitch down, it technically kind of starts as a nail down boot, and then the nails get removed to do the stitch down, right?
Because
But
it was their original way and because they gravitated away from it. But yeah, it's still part of their beginning build,
yep,
beginning of the build.
and in all the pieces where the nails are left in, I mean, that would be how a nail down boot would be done. The difference is you nailed the welt down on top of it, and you remove some of the nails from the toe area. Obviously, that's the biggest thing, right? And then so that leads us to stitch down, otherwise known as Veltshone. A lot of people will know it as Veltshone or know the term Veltshone. It's Dutch. It means field shoe. There's two main kinds of stitch down we're going to talk about right here, and we're going to get a little more in depth in this one because this is more pertinent to the Pacific Northwest. I would love to sit here and geek out about hand welt all day long, but let's be honest, that is a price range that most people are not comfortable with these days. Like, unless you're going Indonesian, you're not going to get any. I think the cheapest hand welt is Brian the Bootmaker at like $1,400. Like I said, creosote is like $1,875 before taxes and shipping. I have hand welt from Flora, and I think her base price is $1,800 before adding on any specialty leathers. Like you do something like ostrich, that's another $1,000. And then like her teacher Lisa Sorrell, her shoes start at $3,500. Her cowboy boots start at $10,000. Hand welting is extremely expensive. But when we move to stitch down, there's two kinds of stitch down we're going to talk about. One is just your standard stitch down, which I don't think either of us are 100% a fan of. And the second one is the stitch down with the McKay lock stitch. Now let's talk about that a little bit. What are the main advantages of stitch down? Stitch down does three things in an equivalent or better way than most of the other hand welting or most of the other welting mechanisms. One, there are no holes in the upper for water to seep through, which is big if you work in your boots. Number two, there is no gimming. It's obviously it won't be the case for hand welting, but there's no gimming for your toes to sit on, which create this kind of like U-shaped cavity inside your boot where your big toe and your little toe sit on the gimming that does not break in, if it ever does, near as fast as the cork and the stuff in the middle is going to break down. It's a very flat method. It's I'm gonna say it's more comfortable, but like bear in mind if someone's doing a not very good McKay lock stitch and your toes are sitting on it and you can feel it, obviously that's going to be slightly uncomfortable too. But generally speaking, if they know what they're doing, it's going to be more comfortable and you're not going to feel that McKay lock stitch at all. And the third big thing is if you have that McKay lock stitch, anybody can resole your stitch down boots. There's a rumor, there's a I shouldn't say rumor, fallacy, misinformation, lack of information that stitch down boots aren't resolable without the last. If you are getting your stitch down boots from a maker that's using the McKay lock stitch, the McKay lock stitch will hold the midsole in place. The cobbler can literally peel the outsole off and just follow the holes. Now, if that McKay lock stitch has been removed, they do have to worry about the layers separating as they're pulling it apart. That's what the McKay lock stitch is there for. But generally speaking, there's nothing about stitch down that makes it not resolable. And the resolable, rebuildability, repairability of stitch down is why one of the biggest reasons why someone would use it for a work boot, because tools are meant to be worn and replaced, and that's what work boots really are.
Oh, I mean, we're talking about these interchangeably, but they're really almost separate categories. And the McKay lock stitch or the Blake stitch, which are the same thing. One of them is who invented it, and the other one is who was able to finance the machines to make it more used in the industry.
Blake invented,
So,
McKay made the machine.
right. So that's one step. I mean, and that's going in through the inside and putting a stitch around that's holding everything together. That's holding your midsole and your insole and everything together. The stitch down itself is separate, and it's one of the reasons why it is better is because it's less pieces. It's always better when you can use less pieces to put things together. So you're having the vamp come down, and then it's turning and it's going back out to where it gets stitched down. So there isn't there, when the same leather is going outward like that, there literally is nothing that can be no water that can be coming in through that area.
I'm going to show a picture
And
here.
even if you had it coming from underneath, the McKay lock stitch holding everything together keeps it from coming in at that point as well.
Yeah, I've got a picture up here on the screen right now of a stitch down. This is a pair of Frank's monkey boots. That's the lineman's patch you're seeing there. But this is what we're talking about, where, as you can see, there's no extra material, there's no gap. This is actually the upper that is flared out and stitched down, not an additional piece of leather. I've brought the picture down.
So uh, there are companies that have stopped doing the McKay lock stitch. They've said that it's not important. They've said that people's toes are rubbing up against it and hurting it, which is bullshit.
I think they were
It's
also
it's
destroying
it's an
boots.
it's an excuse to try to sell to people who don't know any better, but it's BS. I mean, the only way you're going to feel that stitch is if you're wearing your boots barefoot, and even then, it'd be a stretch to be able to say that you could feel it. And if by some miracle you could, it's because somebody wasn't doing it correctly.
Yeah, wrong tension, not getting it close enough to the edge. I think the other thing is they were also destroying boots, pulling the last out because the last has to be removed to do it, and that's being done at a
And it's an
stage.
expensive machine, and
Oh
it's a
yeah,
discontinued machine, and the pieces to fix the machine are becoming harder and harder to find because they're not being made either. So, I can certainly understand not wanting to do it, but it's not as good. And anybody telling you it is as good is feeding you a line.
well yeah. Let's talk about that because the McKay lock stitch is kind of an integral part to some of the extra water resistance that you get out of the stitch down method. Because as we said, you're not putting any holes in your upper or your footbed for water to get in, right? But that McKay lock stitch is doing two things. One, it's protecting against glue separation of the midsole and insole, which is one way water gets in. And the second thing it's doing is holding those layers together so that if the glue and the stitches start failing on the actual stitch down itself, you have at least something helping to hold parts of your boot together, right? That way you're not relying solely on glue through that layer and allowing voids to be created. It's keeping that tight because, in the process of doing the making and you're hammering it down and you're flattening it out and pushing all the air out, part of the thing that McKay lock stitch does is if there isn't any air put out, it is still tightly holding those layers together so that those cavities don't get any bigger. Right, so you're not getting any gaps in the middle. If there is a gap, it's not slowly doing this because the stitches are keeping it from doing that. Because that's the reality here is there's no such thing as a waterproof boot. Well, there is. It's called a single piece rubber injected boot called a galosh. That's the waterproof boot. Anything that's got stitching layers, Gore-Tex liner, doesn't matter. You've got holes that the Teflon tape eventually wears out on. You've got a Gore-Tex liner, which, especially for hand-lasted boots, is very easy to crack and break in the creation process, let alone something get pulled too tight and wearing it, that Gore-Tex liner crack and break. Any boot that's got a Gore-Tex liner, after so much wear, that Gore-Tex liner becomes a failable part, just like anything else, because it's just a very thin, probably what 3 millimeter piece, maybe, if you no, probably not even that thick, honestly. It's probably thinner than that in between the layers. So it flexes and breaks. It's any just like any other synthetic. Why do the Thorogood rubber welts suck? Because after 1,000 miles, most of the time they're cracked. So Gore-Tex lining is something we talk about, but the other thing is a lot of boots don't have fully gusseted tongues. And what do fully gusseted tongues have? Stitching holes in them where water can get through.
Yeah, I mean, and that doesn't even talk about the breathability and how
Oh
much
yeah.
more your feet will sweat, and that'll start decaying your boot from the inside out,
Mm-hmm.
um, getting the extra moisture in there, not being able to get all that moisture out. It's only waterproof for a short period of time, um, and you're not going to realize that it's not waterproof anymore until your feet do get wet. So talking about waterproof boots is a bit of a fallacy, and it's really something that people shouldn't consider. I mean, it's a fairy tale, and it's still a fairy tale.
Yep.
It's
They even make pieces
get
that you can
thick
put
real
over the boot.
leather, and you can do a good enough job of water resistance
Yep. And
without.
yeah,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
they make add-ons that you can put over your boots as well. A lot of the guys up in the Pacific, like that actually live in the Pacific Northwest, they have these custom things, like they're called snow tracks that go like over the top of your boot. That's like a galosh with a, looks like one of those ratchets on like a snowboarding boot, that goes over the snowboard.
Believer, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
that's
it's
it. Yeah.
yeah, and they put those on for the snow season. Not to mention, you can get galoshes anywhere, and you can also get galoshes made that go halfway up your legs and whatnot. I mean that's just the real reality when it comes to waterproof. There's a reason that especially if you grew up in the Midwest, you had a pair of galoshes as a kid.
But over boots is the answer, because otherwise you're giving up on all this arch support and correcting for your hips and correcting for your back and everything that these higher quality boots are doing for you and lasting longer and everything else. If you're taking those off in order to put something on crappier just because you think it's waterproof, you're not doing anything or anyone any favors, especially yourself. So over boots is the answer. Keep them around, put them on for 5, 10 minutes, an hour when you're going to be doing something particularly messy, and then pull it off, hose it off, and you've still got your feet supported in some good quality footwear.
Yep. And this is why stitch down is considered the main work boot welting method. It's got a good price associated with it. It's got a good amount. It's not the most adjustable method that ever existed, but it's got enough adjustability to matter. And it's probably one of the simpler at-home rebuild technologies, or even from a vendor rebuild technologies of the other welting methods available.
That's the main stuff. There are some little things. There's a braided welt.
Yes,
I don't
that
remember
goes
whether we
into.
had any photos ready for that.
Yep, I've got the Norwegian. So this is a combo. So this has got a Norwegian braid welt on top of what's called a double welt right here. This is a pair of Tahuras in blue shinky horse rump, and Norwegian welts are mostly decorative. I've heard some stuff recently about people trying to say that they're a more waterproof method because it holds the leather tighter to the upper. But I encourage everybody, please think about that. You're punching holes higher up in the upper than you are in the other leather method or other welting methods. Of course, the more holes there are on your upper, the less water resistant it's going to be, regardless of how tightly they're pulled against it. It's just another point for water to eventually enter, especially if you're standing in ankle deep water. But this is a braided welt. Only one of these, this one that I'm highlighting here with my mouse, this is the only one actually passing through the upper itself. The other two are actually moving in a daisy chain method across this. So it's punching through, coming up. The others are pulling through, pushing back down, pulling tight. It is a decorative welt. This serves
Totally decorative.
no
It looks
functionality.
cool.
Yeah, it looks cool. It does give you some flexibility advantage, but that's only against traditional hand welt. Like in terms, like it's giving you some of the flexibility of stitch down essentially in the way it's doing this method. But it's once again, that is really splitting hairs. This is start to finish a decorative welt. Stairwelt's kind of the same thing. Stairwelt is a way of doing a hand welt with an extra layer. So essentially, what it is it's hand welted, right? And then they leave the midsole slightly proud by 3 millimeters and do an extra outsole stitch through it. The biggest benefit of it is for hand welting methods that leave a bigger cavity due to how much they cut away the insole. The stairwelt method, one, it's aesthetic, but number two, it allows them to have that midsole a little bit closer so that they don't have to pack as much filler in there. That's really all it is. But if we're being honest, it is it's an aesthetic welt. And then next to that, I have, that's a Norwegian roll welt. Here's a traditional stair welt, which is the same thing that I just showed you, except for there's no Norwegian piece to it. And this is literally just a hand welted piece that is then the midsole is left proud and sewn down. Like this is actually kind of replicating the stitch down McKay lock stitch method. It's some of the similar process to that, but it is purely aesthetic. There's no extra value you're really gaining from this, short of making it maybe slightly easier to resole. But even then, we're really splitting hairs there because that's not even 100% true. It's true enough from the difficulty level of it, of you can't accidentally pull the boot apart as you're tearing it down too much and rip the layers apart because there's extra stitching. I mean, I don't know. Yes, it makes it easier, but like, I mean, are we really making it that easier? We're just making it more stupid proof is what we're really doing. I guess that's by definition easier, but I was splitting hairs here. We're splitting hairs really micro thin on that one.
I guess we forgot with the Goodyear welt. It does create a void inside of the sole that does need to be
A large
filled
void.
in. A
It's
large void.
we're looking something around this in terms of thickness. It's a very large void.
And that void is not a good void. They found ways to turn a negative into a positive in designing it, which I mean putting in cork, because the cork is bendable and the cork is forgiving and the cork can mold to your foot faster.
Shock absorption.
But it's also going to start clumping up and it's going to start moving around and it's not really good. They will advertise it as good, but it doesn't have the longevity still. So
It absorbs tons of moisture. Tons of moisture. That's what main thing that causes it to clump really is actually absorbing moisture, whether that's from your foot or you walking in water and it getting in through the holes in the outsole. Now there are different qualities of cork. I'm not going to get into that here because bespoke makers do use it for a reason, but the cork that they use is insanely more expensive than like what Red Wing is putting in a pair of Iron Rangers. Like the cork that they're putting in is almost the same price as the Iron Rangers themselves. Now, one of the ones I had pulled up here, here is a picture of a hand welt. So these are my Florinite bespokes. This is what a traditional hand welt will look like from the outside. You'll see a couple things that'll indicate that it's a hand welt. You'll see what's called a fudge wheel indentations. Sometimes it's called pinking. And these fudge wheel indentations tell them where to essentially push the awl through for doing the outsole stitch by hand. Now, a lot of makers these days put these on after the fact just because they think they look cool and it kind of gives it a look of a more high-end boot. But that's what you will see from a traditional hand welt. That was the stair welt. This right here is a pair of whites. This is a Norwegian roll welt. This is what you'll see some of the Pacific Northwest makers, and essentially they've combined two methods. They have mixed hand welting and hand lasting with stitch down. Now, what you'll see in this picture is you'll see two stitch down layers, but in this roll here that you see, which, in this wax flesh looks kind of crappy, but it is what it is, there is actually stitches that go through the uppers into the footbed. Now, when White's does it, they just cut a channel with a knife that they pass through. It's the same way when Frank's does it. There's no hold fast carving or anything like I showed you earlier. It is a very stripped down version of a hand welt. I think Frank's minus specialty leathers. That the piece of leather is more expensive. I think they charge what, $60 for the hand welt, the Norwegian roll welt.
Yes.
Um,
Yep. Yeah.
and it follows the same stitch down process because remember, stitch down, hand welt, all completely hand lasted. It's just in the hand lasting, instead of nailing it down, letting it set, and then putting an outsole on and flaring it out. In this case, what they do is while the nails are still in, they will hand welt it. They'll cut a channel with a knife, just a straight, flat channel, and it's just somewhere for the awl to push through and the stitches to set. There'll be a little bit more of a gap since it's done at an angle. It'll punch the leather at a slightly higher up spot than it would in a traditional hand welt. Like I said, there's a reason it's called Norwegian, because just like the other Norwegian picture I showed, it's actually going in the uppers to where you can see a little bit from the inside. Whereas a hand welt, you won't be able to see it all from the inside. And then once that piece is flared out, it follows the rest of the stitch down process.
It is a bit of a marketing situation. It's billed as being traditional, but the way that they're doing it really isn't traditional. Uh, Billed as traditional, even though they used to do nail down. So it's not even traditional for them. I mean, when White started making boots, it's not what they were doing. When Nick started building boots, it's not what they were doing. So, it's a situation where it's billed as being a traditional choice that wasn't really traditional for them.
Yeah,
And
even
it's not traditional, period, because it's a combination of processes. Uh, and White's is very proud of it. White's tries to stick to it. They make a big deal out of telling everybody about it, but it's not as waterproof. It's not as tough. Uh, you know, there's a reason why Frank's doesn't, do it normally on any of their boots, because it is not as tough of a choice. It's not as waterproof of a choice. It's not as good of a longevity choice, but it's cool and it's different and it does take more time to build and it is a bragging right. And if you want it, you can have it for $60. Whereas White's holds on to it as a pinnacle, as a great thing, as a better thing when it's not. Uh, and then they make their cheaper boots out of what's actually a better method.
Yep. Oh, and it's important because, like, even if we get past the waterproofness of it, the biggest disadvantage to it is actually particles getting down there. So eventually, as the waxes wear off on those threads, particles will get down in there and they create micro abrasives that are now working in between the midsole and the insole layers. And not only are they grinding that leather away, they're letting bacteria and other, like, rotting start happening to the leather. And that's really the biggest problem of it. You'll actually find that people who work in like with fine dusts and particles tend to have more problems with that method faster than people who even work in water.
For casual wear, for a white collar person who's wearing their boots more casual, there really is no negative to the Norwegian welt. It is a cool welt. It is a good, cool design. If you're in the elements, it's not as good.
Yep. I would say certain leathers don't look as good. Like the picture I showed with cinnamon wax flesh, that is not a particularly pleasing looking roll welt.
It really looks like a gemming on that. It's
Yeah, it's because that the wax layers kind of crack and get fuzzy. There are ones that do look good. The smoother leathers or just the pure rough out leathers do tend to look quite a bit better with that
I got
method. Oh, hey, yeah, yeah. Don't you have the zucchinis in the yeah? See, this is a leather that
I made sure these were handy.
yeah.
I had Franks do this one as a is it focused?
Yep, we can see it.
I had that. This is the only pair that I have in the Norwegian rolled welt. and I did it for bragging rights. I did it because it was neat, and I did it because this boot is only going to see casual wear. So I thought it would be cool to do it. But it's my only pair that's going to use this method because, like I said, it's not as good and it costs more for really no good reason other than it took more time to build, and
And
time is
uses a little
money.
bit more leather. Yep. And that does bring up one really good point. Why would someone choose to not do stitch down on a casual leather? Let me see if the picture that I had shows this well. Where was it? You can kind of see it in my picture of my monkey boot here, but you'll see this kind of creasing line that exists right here. That is caused by the 5-in-1 machine that they use to seal the welt down to the midsole. There's an edge on it that does kind of run this line into your boots, that if they get the 5-in-1 machine a little close, aesthetically wise, you'll see there's this creasing that a lot of people don't like. That is the one negative I can think of a stitch down boot. And that kind of more has to do with the process of it. That if those kind of aesthetics matter, that's something to think about, especially in the stiffer leathers, because you'll see it in the pair that Jeff had there, the pair that I showed. Anything on the higher temper scale, which to be fair, most of us should be going with higher temper boots. They last longer. It is going to leave a crease there, and if that bothers you, a Norwegian hand welt can mitigate that a little bit because the 5-in-1 machine is blocked by that rolled piece a little bit. You're going to get it from walking a little bit anyway, but that's something to think about. That is maybe a reason why that $60 might be a little more worth it.
The little wrinkle thing,
Yep.
is that what you're talking
Yep.
about?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's caused by the edge of the 5-in-1.
it's funny because I remember seeing those in Carl's video on the Frank's Patriots, and he's pointing it out like it's an error that quality control missed, and it's not. It's not an error. It's not a quality control thing. It's a good stiff stick thick quality leather, and that's what it's going to do. The fact that it's there is actually an indication of a quality tough boot, not an indication of something wrong, somebody not doing a good enough job.
Yep.
If they had used a thinner leather, if they had used a lower quality leather,
Or
if they had
softer leather.
used a less a softer temper leather, then you wouldn't have had that. But you also wouldn't have had as good of a boot.
Yep. But like I said, if that bothers you, the Norwegian hand welt, that might be $60 well invested to combat that a little bit. Uh,
That covers it.
Actually, there's one that we didn't that I saw in my pictures here, and that is the storm welt. So this is a
Oh yeah.
specialty welt. There's also called a split reverse welt. They're close to the same thing. But when it comes to hand welted boots, there's this method here called a storm welt. The idea being that it helps beating water roll off the side of your boot a little bit more so that you don't get as much getting into the crease. You see this sometimes with Goodyear welted boots and hand welted boots, and it's just a welt that has a little bump there that's to allow the upper to sit just a little bit closer to the welt and allow beating water to roll down. And split reverse
An
welts is go
an
ahead.
exaggerated gemming.
Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. A split reverse well is literally like putting a gimming on the outside. Honestly, that's where they split the welt down the center and they squish it in. But that's more of a decoration. Like the split reverse welt doesn't really do a whole lot. The storm welt there, that's from actually a thicker welt that has the bump carved in, so that there's no structural cutting to it like the split reverse welt. But I mean, once again, these are, for lack of better words, really aesthetic welts. There's nothing about the storm welt short of beating water, and I mean literally just beating water running down from rain, that's going to be any more water resistant than any other hand welt. And
Well,
honestly,
it's protecting the inside part of the gemming on a Goodyear welted belt. Sorry, Goodyear welted boot. It's protecting that inner part of the stitching as the leather and the gemming are coming together. And it's, any water that would be, maybe if you're standing in a puddle of water that was just more than your outsole, but not quite up to the leather of your vamp, of your boot itself, then that's going to be an added protection. But I think it's looks, and even then, it's not a positive look.
I like the look of it.
Doc Martens on their tougher steel-toed boots uses it quite a bit, the storm welt, but they're using it because they think that it looks tough.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing too is Doc Martens is using a sidewall stitch that's very close to a Norwegian welt, right? And that pair I showed there is a pair of my Brian the Bootmaker underdogs. So those are hand welted. But even on these, you can see there's just enough of a gap there that short of beating water, it's not doing anything. I just did it because it looked cool with that boot. Would I get another storm welt? Probably not. But I thought it looked cool at the time, so I got it. I mean, honestly, it might actually look a little bit better with a regular hand welt, but especially when you look at like my Floras in comparison to that, like the Floras boots are extremely sexy. And I think that covers most of my pictures here that I had. I'll kind of go through them again real quick so everyone can see them on screen of the different styles that we showed, just in case anybody missed them at any point in the video. But that right there is welts. If you guys have any questions, please put them in the comment section down below. I think maybe in the next one, Jeff, we should maybe cover any of the questions we had from the first two episodes.
We have
And
one more real good one there that I remember.
okay,
Another one, I guess I already addressed pretty fully in the comments.
okay. Well, I mean, if there's not any
But
other
yeah, ask
questions,
any questions, whether we answer them in the thread or whether it turns into another video, will depend on the question.
yep.
Yeah, and please like, subscribe, and like I said, we appreciate your comments, and I'm always looking at them.
Hope you guys have a great day.
All right, cheers.